Okay, hello. I don't get a mic.
I know, I was going to say, you got short.
I ordinarily don't need one. Thanks, everybody. I don't bear the microphone. Sorry about that. So good afternoon. It's great to see so many people out here. I'm Steve Slick, the director of the Intelligence Studies Project, for those of you whom I don't already know. Welcome to our conversation today with the author of The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. And before I introduce today's guests, let me just take an opportunity, since I have you here captive in your chairs, tell you about an important event that's coming up next week. On Monday at 12:15 in the Bass Lecture Hall, which is just down the corridor and down the stairs, we're going to host a conversation with Dr. Salam Fayyad, the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian National Authority. Some of you may remember Dr. Fayyad's last visit to campus almost 2 years ago, and that was, of course, before the April 7 attacks and on southern Israel and Israel's military response against Hamas in Gaza. Dr. Fayyad is one of the most widely respected political figures in the Middle East, and not coincidentally, he's a UT distinguished alumnus and a Longhorn dad. So today's program, of course, is more of an opportunity to learn about U.S. intelligence, its history and current challenges. But equally important for us, this is something of a showcase for exceptional young scholars working in the fields of intelligence studies and history. Jeff's going to tell us first a little bit about his impressive new book project, and then he'll join a moderated conversation with our own Alexandra Sukula. For those of you who are not yet familiar with Alexandra, she's an assistant professor of national security affairs here at the LBJ School and fellow with both the Clements Center and the Intelligence Studies Project. She's also the author of an exciting forthcoming book that you'll hear more about, I suspect, in the fall. Not by chance, both Jeff and Alexandra are past recipients of ISP's Bobby R. Inman Award for Outstanding Student Scholarship in Intelligence Studies. Alexandra won the Inman Award in 2021 for her dissertation on the Soviet Union's domestic security services, while Jeff was recognized in 2019 for an excellent paper on civil intelligence relations and the so-called American Black Chamber that operated in New York during the interwar years. We're proud of both of them and happy to have them share the stage today. So, Dr. Jeff Rogg is a senior research fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute, previously an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University and the Citadel. Jeff is also a postdoctoral fellow at the Naval War College. He's the vice president of the Society for Intelligence History. He's way overeducated, so I'll give you a short version of this. He earned a BA from Swarthmore, a JD from Villanova School of Law, an MA from Georgetown Security Studies Program, and a PhD in history from an Ohio State University. Sorry, Jeff, I couldn't resist. The Buckeyes last year during football season beat both the Longhorns and my Nittany Lions in the same season, so that's unforgivable. Spy and the State will be published by Oxford University Press next month. I've seen the manuscript, made it through the introduction last weekend. It's an extremely ambitious project that has the potential to be an important history and reference for those of us who teach in the intelligence field. It's at the top of my summer reading list. So please welcome Dr. Jeff Rogg to the 40 Acres.
Well, thank you all. Hopefully, can everyone hear me? First, I really do want to express my deep gratitude for being here today. As Steve said, I don't think I would be here without the Inman Award. It was something that I needed. It gave me confidence in my work as a PhD student. And so, this is really kind of where the book began. And so we're coming full circle. Speaking of which, there's a very famous line in Tennyson's poem Ulysses that says, "I'm a part of all that I've met." And so I want to bring a personal part of the story together with the academic part, especially for this audience, which includes students, graduate, undergraduate students. And so on the slide up here, I have a ship, and I'm going to get back to it, but the ship is part of my personal and academic story. As is the title of this presentation, Uncivil Intelligence Relations. It's the title of a chapter in my book on the Civil War. and the ship is from the Civil War, building some pieces and some hints there. And this was the first full-length chapter I wrote for my dissertation. Like the Inman Award paper on the Cipher Bureau, the American Black Chamber, what I was trying to do is show how civil intelligence relations can help explain American intelligence history. And so with that, bridging the gap, next slide, this is what we do, right? I'm an interdisciplinarian, and although my PhD is in history, I don't encourage other students to do this too. Overeducated. So I have a legal background, security studies background, even a little bit of classics mixed in. But if you look at the title of the dissertation, not the book, it's The Spy and the State, the History and Theory of American Civil Intelligence Relations. And equally important for this venue, we're not just trying to build the bridge within academia. I also think it's important, and this is something that I know the Intelligence Studies Project does, the Clements Center, the Strauss Center. We're trying to contribute to American national security and to American constitutionalism. And so I share your mission in trying to fill these pieces together within academia, between academia and national security, and between academia and the public. So thank you too, because I know there's members of the public here. So even though, next slide, please, we're trying to pull pieces together, I often feel like we're stretching just to hold them together. And I want to talk about this struggle. Next slide. So the struggle to create American intelligence, because we often think that creating something is a collaborative effort. But one of the things I'm going to pose to you today is that creating the American intelligence system in the US intelligence community was a product of competition, not really cooperation. And indeed, the US intelligence community, which it's been called that since the early 1950s, exhibits competition as much as cooperation, as I'm sure our distinguished practitioners in the audience can attest. And a big part of this historical competition over intelligence is really fundamentally about control. Controlling the institution of intelligence, controlling different intelligence organizations, controlling different intelligence capabilities. So as it says up on the screen, and I might ask my patient clicker to click through these, this screen isn't actually blank. I love audience participation. We're gonna have some Q&A, but I'm gonna ask for your help real quick filling this in. So first up, and this is a layup, what does this organization do? And if you know the ints, just shout out an int. Humint, there we go. All right, next. SIGINT, there we go. Yeah, now you're starting to participate a little bit. Not get too sleepy during lunch. Good, next. IMINT, good. And last but not least, domestic intelligence, counterintelligence, good. So clicking through what we have here, and next please. Note the functional division of the US intelligence community. I mean, we have a lot of money and resources, so we just have an organization for everything. I also want to point out though, which of these organizations are independent up here? It's only the CIA. ODNI also independent organization, but most of the organizations and members of the US intelligence community are subordinated to a different institution and profession of national security and an executive department that represents it. So up here, for instance, FBI is under DOJ, NGA and NSA are under DOD. And I also have, because this is important, the DOD owns the lion's share of the US intelligence community in terms of resources and personnel and half the organizational membership. Next up, please. So there's a couple arenas for this competition. I hope you're entertained. And the first is that I'll talk about the president versus Congress. The president and Congress compete over intelligence. It's not just cooperation. And you'll see this especially early in the history. Next, we have bureaucratic competition on a couple different levels. So you have interinstitutional competition between institutions like the military, diplomacy, and law enforcement. You also have competition at the departmental level between different executive departments. You have competition organizationally over key intelligence functions, missions, personnel. You have personal competition. This came up in our lunch during with Paul Pope and Steve Slick about personal rivalries. They matter in government. And so that actually affected the shape of the intelligence community. And then you have functional competition over key intelligence functions. And something that's important today to bring in is how technology actually can exacerbate this, because new technology creates new capabilities, creates a new arena for competition. Next, please. So let's get started, and stop me if you've heard this story before. In the beginning, intelligence was void. And then Wild Bill Donovan said, let there be, go ahead, central intelligence. That's how US intelligence history begins, isn't it? I'm going to start the story a little earlier than that. And I want to preface this history by saying, just because we have the system we have today doesn't mean that it was preordained. The system we have was the result of particular decisions made at particular points in time to suit certain conditions. And oftentimes, those decisions were made on the basis of things as petty as personal rivalries. And so, for the students in the audience, although it may seem too big to change, nothing is too big to change. And sometimes we use that as an excuse not to change when we really need to. So back to Donovan, I'm going to start this story a little bit earlier. A lot of history of American intelligence, and especially the contemporary intelligence system, starts with the Second World War. I have to warn you, though, that when a historian tells you they're going to start a story earlier, it could be decades or centuries or millennia. And for me, though, I'm just going to start at the beginning of the United States. So, too soon? In the beginning, at the beginning of the American constitutional system, one of the things that we take for granted, and this goes back to the title of my book, The Spy in the State, is derivative of Samuel Huntington's The Soldier of the State, if you're familiar with his book on civil-military relations. And in it, Huntington is clear that the Constitution acts as a structural constant on civil-military relations, because the U.S. military is mentioned in clauses of the U.S. Constitution. Where's intelligence in the U.S. Constitution? It's not there. This is a big problem for a country like ours, where our foundational document doesn't say anything about intelligence, more particularly when a lot of the people who created it were actually involved in intelligence during the Revolutionary War. So from the very beginning, we've had to sort of struggle with the absence of intelligence in the US Constitution. So what do? We read it in. For example, we know under the US Constitution that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So I like to say that under the Constitution, the president is the spy master-in-chief of the US intelligence community. The president's the national intelligence consumer. Similarly, we can read congressional oversight into the Constitution through the power of the purse. So the struggle between Congress and the spy master-in-chief began in the earliest days of the American constitutional system. And in his first annual address to Congress, today we call it the State of the Union Address, George Washington requested a special fund from Congress that he would use to support the conduct of foreign relations. That's sort of how it was framed. What it was known as was the Contingent Fund for Foreign Intercourse, but later years, it was called more appropriately the Secret Service Fund. And even at the time, members of Congress knew what they were signing up for. Because what it does is it allows the American president to pay spies personally and conduct intelligence activities without informing Congress at all. So in other words, it sort of built in a clause where the president can protect what we call today sources and methods. Now, the Congress almost immediately recognizes its mistake. It gave the president this huge power, and the president doesn't even need to report back what they're doing. And so even though Congress, and I mean, this is kind of typical today, reallocates the contingent fund year after year, it keeps on debating the contingent fund throughout the 18th and the 19th centuries. And the questions are, did we give the president too much power? Should the president have to report the details of how they're using the contingent fund? So talk about the intelligence activities you're doing. And then there's a very important cultural and ideological piece. Congress also debates whether we want our country engaging in intelligence, and really we're talking about espionage at all. It's dishonorable. That's not what the US is about. And so for the grad students in the room, and the undergrad students as well, be prepared to laugh at my pain, and hopefully you learn from this. But researching legislative history is extraordinarily painful, like reading the congressional debates. It made even more painful when you actually have to write a book manuscript and go back and check all your sources and quotations and citations. So have a good record-keeping system. But back to the congressional debate, I also want to note another feature of this competition in Congress. Oftentimes what occurred is the president from one political party would use the contingent fund to support an intelligence-type mission. And then members of Congress from the rival political party would challenge it. So there was sort of a partisan dimension to this. What this did is it fractured Congress politically, and so you didn't really have unity of effort to assert congressional intelligence oversight. So similar to today with, for instance, the War Powers Act, what you see is the presidents jealously guarded their prerogative over intelligence from Congress. And back-to-back presidents, John Tyler and James Polk, basically settle the issue. And I have the quotes up here, but the long and short of it is the president says, this intelligence, this is national security stuff. You have no business getting involved. And this basically settles the issue of congressional intelligence oversight for almost 100 years until the Church Committee, with a few minor exceptions. So just to give you the parameters of this first American intelligence system, it's designed around the Secret Service Fund, which is America's first black budget. It's America's first statutory law regarding intelligence, as I see it. And the president would personally control intelligence. It was called the hub and spoke model. The president's in the middle. The president pays spies to go off and conduct certain activities, somewhat diplomatic, somewhat intelligence. And the president's in the middle and everyone reports back. So this is the hub and spoke model. But then the hub comes loose during the Civil War. So I'm going to revisit the ship. One example of how the president can no longer control intelligence is the ship and this gentleman, Henry Sheldon Sanford. And he is officially the US Minister to Belgium, but he's unofficially the Union spy master in Europe. Now, the problem by the time the Civil War comes around is not only is the country too big for the president to personally manage, but the Civil War is too big, let alone the intelligence issues. And so what you see is large executive departments, and namely State, War, and Navy, begin to use the Secret Service Fund to pay for their own spies and intelligence activities. And that's one of the things that Sanford did. And so Sanford writes a few letters that I thought were really compelling and important for American intelligence history, because he's basically begging William Seward, the Secretary of State, to coordinate State Department intelligence. He's like, this is too uncoordinated. And he even says that the Union needs more of a national intelligence policy. So, long before the creation of CIA, you had a far-seeing individual who already could see that there were coordination problems plaguing the American intelligence effort. And one of the places where this coordination was important was in the grand strategy of the Civil War for the Union, the blockade, and stopping blockade runners from reaching the Confederacy. The Bahama was a blockade runner, and one of his spies, Sanford's spies, sketched this ship, and Sanford passes it off to William Seward and says, you need to get this to the Navy and we need to stop this ship. So the larger point, though, is during the Civil War, we see how the control of intelligence shifts from the president, direct presidential control, to departmental control in executive departments. And we also see the coordination problems that emerge between these departments. So following the Civil War, we have the birth of the US intelligence community, because several executive departments create their own intelligence organizations, and I have a few up here. So it begins down with the Office of Naval Intelligence in 1882, then the Army with the Military Information Division in 1885, Secret Service, as we know today, it does Treasury, but actually at the time it was counterfeiting. It starts doing intelligence on its own, so I count it. And then last but not least, we have what is today the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but when it was created, it was the Bureau of Investigation. What I want to stress about all these organizations, though, is that none of them are independent. All of them are subordinated to a different institution of national security in a different executive department. And so these departments are going to compete over intelligence, and this results in the slower stunted development of a truly independent American intelligence profession. So a great place where we see this is the First World War. There's an old Bedouin proverb, me and my brothers against my cousins, me and my cousins against the world. I think this holds true not just for intelligence in the First World War, but really intelligence in some ways today. So during the First World War, all of the existing intelligence organizations are competing over domestic intelligence in the United States. They're all conducting domestic intelligence. So this is weird today because the military was very involved in spying on American citizens at the time. The competition, though, was particularly fierce between the Secret Service and the Bureau of Investigation. And the BOI signed off, and I have an example from the Library of Congress that I found, on these badges that said Secret Service Division. Except they weren't for the Secret Service. They were for a group called the American Protective League. And the APL was essentially a civilian paramilitary accessory force that would help the intelligence services spy on Americans, detain them, conduct slacker raids, where they pull in conscripts. So this is actually really shady constitutional stuff too. But this misrepresentation of the Secret Service Division really bothers the real Secret Service. And so the Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, writes to Woodrow Wilson, and he says, all of these organizations are doing domestic intelligence, and our wires are crossed. So that was an expression that I saw a few times, our wires are crossed. The Attorney General, Thomas Watt Gregory, writes back to Wilson and says, our wires aren't crossed, the Secret Service is doing intelligence it shouldn't be involved in. And so the organizational competition over domestic intelligence has far-reaching effects that we still feel today. Because what happens is the BOI, Bureau of Investigation, aligns with the military services in this big meeting in March 1918, and it sort of cuts the Secret Service out of domestic intelligence. And then once it does that, it turns its sights on the military services and it starts to push them out too. And so what you're seeing is the Bureau of Investigation, which today is the FBI, still owns and jealously guards domestic intelligence, really begins to win this key function in the First World War period. And this competition also undermines intelligence coordination because the different organizations aren't really talking together. And this becomes its own topic of debate. So McAdoo and a gentleman I don't have up here, Secretary of State Robert Lansing, both write to Woodrow Wilson during the war and say, foreshadowing, we need a central organization to coordinate intelligence. So this discussion about central intelligence also antedates a lot of the literature where we talk about the CIA beginning really with the Second World War. That's when coordination issues happened. They happened far before that. Next slide, please. Now, that being said, the Second World War was a watershed moment for American intelligence. Key figures, and I had them up earlier, Willard J. Donovan, pick up where Lansing and McAdoo leave off, and they begin advocating for a central intelligence organization that would, among other things, and this is a very important document, November 18th, 1944, Donovan writes to FDR, and the two things I want to highlight, the two things that he says this will require are first, that intelligence control be sent back to the president. So Donovan had realized, and a lot of the OSS memorandum at the time talk about this, that control of intelligence had shifted to departments, and they weren't coordinating. So Donovan says we need to return control to you, FDR, which if you knew about FDR, FDR loved hearing that he was going to be put in control of something. So this is kind of tugging at his ego. Donovan was very good at tugging at FDR's ego. The second thing is he says it's going to require a central authority to coordinate intelligence, a central intelligence agency. And so this document, by the way, kicks off something you can call it the memorandum wars, but enormous back and forth between the FBI, the military components, the JCS, Army intelligence, naval intelligence. I mean, everyone is in this debate, and it's bitter at times. Now, what I found also remarkable about these memorandum wars is what OSS officers were saying. And one of the key pieces in their memoranda that they kept reemphasizing was they tried to distinguish intelligence as a profession of national security from what the military was doing. The OSS was under the JCS, it was a military organization, but the people who were involved in it, they knew they were doing something different. And so what they're trying to outline is the parameters of a true intelligence profession. And so what I like to stress is that the CIA heralded not just the creation of an independent intelligence organization, but also an independent American intelligence profession. And that's something I think the history tends to overlook and how important it is, especially with civil intelligence relations. So not everyone likes this outcome. I said that there were personal rivalries. Here was a personal rivalry. J. Edgar Hoover. Before the Second World War, J. Edgar Hoover had actually positioned himself to be pretty much America's first intelligence czar. And Donovan swoops in 1940 and essentially pulls the title from him. And so the bitterness between the two, and believe it or not, Donovan had been Hoover's boss also in the Department of Justice in the 1920s, but it really becomes a interpersonal rivalry and an organizational rivalry between the FBI and the OSS. And so what Hoover does by the end of the war is he's very put out that his memoranda, where he advocates for the FBI basically being the cornerstone of American intelligence, is rejected by Truman. And so Hoover picks up the foreign intelligence that his FBI had been doing, brings it back from the West, it was in Latin America, the SIS. And essentially what you see in this period is the construction of what we call the wall between foreign and domestic intelligence. And you see a wall between that kind of lasts organizationally between the FBI and the CIA. And this wall becomes a big, contentious area of debate post 9/11. And it was the wall that caused the 9/11 attacks. So expanding on the INS, following the creation of the CIA and during the earlier, what we call the High Cold War, the US intelligence community expands a lot as a product of competition over new technology. and the new intelligence functions it makes possible. Now, I had written about the Cipher Bureau, and the Cipher Bureau, the American Black Chamber, was a great example of competition. But competition over SIGINT just accelerates in the interwar period during the Second World War, and then immediately in the early Cold War, because SIGINT is really critical to fight the Soviet Union. And so therefore that makes it more competitive. And so there's all these different iterations where elements of State Department, FBI, Navy, Air Force, they try and cooperate, and it's just not working. And so eventually what you arrive at, and this is, in abridged history, but in 1952, through memorandum, Truman creates the National Security Agency. And one of the things that I want to emphasize up here is back to the old one and the new one. So the old emblem has underneath it Department of Defense, because to this day, the NSA is a combat support agency under the DoD. But everyone at the time also realized the NSA had national intelligence responsibilities. And so there was kind of a tension in, do we want this organization with national responsibilities to be part of the DoD and therefore a military organization? Likewise, the Air Force and the CIA originally cooperate in the development of overhead reconnaissance satellites. However, it looks pretty good. The collection that they're getting is even better, and so they start competing over it. And eventually, the solution is the creation of another organization, the NRO in 1961. That goes under DoD. NGA takes a little bit longer, but it starts out, the NGA as it's modern known, was named out in 2003. Before that was the National Imagery and Mapping Agency in 1996. But it started out also as a CIA DoD enterprise. And accompanying the creation of these, but not up there, you have the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that's established contemporaneously, basically, with NRO. And in each of these, what you see is we create an organization to sort of be the lead organization for a key intelligence function or responsibility. In DIA's case, it's coordinating defense intelligence. Now, in terms of coordinating all US intelligence, the creation of the CIA didn't resolve the problem of coordinating national intelligence. One of the reasons why is the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, known today as the DCIA, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, was responsible for two big things. One, coordinating American intelligence, and two, the head of the CIA. So this was a conflict of interest, and it didn't sit well with other organizations because depending on who the DCI was, they felt like the DCI was representing the agency more than the intelligence community. And so as early as 1971, and really even before that, there were proposals to divide it. But in 1971, the Schlesinger Report proposes a director of national intelligence. So this is considered decades before we actually create a DNI. You can hit it one more time. It's also proposed in 1978 as well, in 1987 and 1992. Why didn't it happen at any of those points in time? What's the theme today? Competition. Competition. So two of the big opponents every time it comes up are the Secretary of Defense and the DCI, because they have the most to lose. There was also an element of congressional competition between, once you have the establishment of the House and Senate Select Committees on Intelligence, between them and the Armed Services Committees. And so at each juncture, essentially, competition destroys this proposal for a DNI, a Director of National Intelligence. So what forces the issue? 9/11. 9/11 forces the issue. So that overcomes all this bureaucratic rivalry. And it overcomes it partially because Congress leans on the public. We wanted some kind of reform. And when you hear all these agencies, and I mentioned this morning to the Texas Intelligence Academy, but I don't know if you've seen those in the audience, the Spider-Man meme, where all the Spider-Mans are pointing at each other. So that's kind of happening during the 9/11 hearings. But this is why being independent for the CIA hasn't always served the agency well. When the furor over 9/11 happened, all the other organizations, so FBI could duck and cover under DOJ. NSA and DOD components could duck and cover under DOD. CIA is kind of out there by itself saying, I'm just an intelligence agency. FBI also did something that was it was interesting given its history, but essentially FBI kind of says, well, we're not really an intelligence organization, we're a law enforcement organization, but if you want to give us more intelligence powers, then we'll, next 9/11, we'll stop. The FBI had been doing domestic intelligence for 100 years. But it kind of got to say, well, we're not really an intelligence organization. So what happens with the 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act? We give the FBI even more domestic intelligence power. So they got what they wanted. And we actually take from the CIA, and this was why, again, being independent doesn't always serve you well, two major levers of power in terms of this competition. One was the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, and the other was having the DCI, now the DCIA, be the chief national intelligence analyst for the President of the United States. So now you have this dual leadership and this tension between central intelligence and national intelligence. So that roughly takes us to where the structure of the USIC is today. And although I dwelled on authorities and bureaucracies and organizations and the government overall, I also want to emphasize how society, culture, and democracy are involved. And so I left out one really big actor here, the American people, and they're always integral to civil intelligence relations. So here's a sample of historical documents I found, because the American people have influenced American intelligence throughout our history and often in contradictory ways. And so here's some of the contradictions. The first you have from 1803, the Columbian Sentinel, an op-ed by someone basically saying, now the Jefferson administration is using the Secret Service Fund, and when it was the Adams administration, the Democratic Republicans, that's Jefferson's party, were complaining about secrecy and espionage and using the Secret Service Fund. And so this person exclaims, which I think is something concordant with the American tradition, the government of a free country should not keep any secrets, no, not for an instant, from the view of the people. Pretty hard to have an intelligence institution with that attitude. Next you have, and I think I love this cartoon. This is a rendering of a Spanish spy with all the little elements of tradecraft there, daggers, false mustaches, uniforms, from 1898, the Spanish-American War. And one of the things that I found remarkable and alarming was just how many average citizens wrote in, not just to the Secret Service, but to President McKinley himself, saying, my neighbor's a spy, my priest is a spy, my employee is a spy. So when the American people are scared, we really welcome domestic intelligence. But not really, because the middle piece is from 1908, and it says, this is an alarming headline, espionage exists. What it's talking about is domestic intelligence, because during the first decade of the 20th century, the Secret Service gets caught spying on American citizens and members of Congress for the Roosevelt administration. And as a result of this outcry, Congress investigates the Secret Service. And this is in the news constantly, so that's just one clipping. But one of the sort of agreements that you see reached with Congress and the public through the press is we need law enforcement in this country, but we don't want domestic intelligence. We don't need a domestic spy system. Ironically, the Attorney General at the time, Charles Bonaparte, who's related to the more famous Bonaparte, creates the BOI, the Bureau of Investigation, without notifying Congress, and it immediately jumps into doing domestic intelligence. So it picks up right where the Secret Service left off. Then we have a game down here from the Second World War where it's supposed to help Americans smash the Nazi spy ring. So how do you identify spies? And so once again, when we're afraid, domestic intelligence, sure, why not? But the worm always turns. And so this last piece, which is a newspaper clipping, really a big deal article, but in February 1945, Walter Troen, who was a journalist, leaks Donovan's plan for a post-war intelligence system, and this creates a national furor. Basically, different versions of the headlines would say, FDR plans American Gestapo, or New Deal plans domestic spy system or global spy system. And what's important about that is this is where civil society actually affected legislative outcomes. Because the legislation that created the CIA, originally there was no stipulation in it that the CIA couldn't do domestic intelligence, but people kept bringing it up in testimony to Congress. And so eventually you have in the legislation, the 1947 National Security Act, a stipulation that the CIA will not conduct domestic intelligence or have police powers. So, the congressmen were saying, Americans won't let this happen. And so it actually influences the shape of our statutory law. I have another piece, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, on this story, because there's a historiographical debate over who leaked the information. One of my friends, Nick Reynolds, he goes with this view that it was FDR because he didn't like where Donovan was going with it. Other people say that it was competitors in military intelligence who did it. I found salacious piece of information that I shared with Nick and Bev Gage, who wrote the great book G-Man, and John Fox, who's the FBI historian, and none of them had seen it before. And so, for grad students, again, like, this is a really fun research find for you. So I'll share it with you. But the bigger point here is, again, public opinion. Public opinion is not only responsible for changing statutory law, but it also helps with the construction of that artificial wall between foreign and domestic intelligence. So this leads me to today and some polling. And I know that ISP is doing some polling too, but the point of this polling is that the American people, us, remain consistently inconsistent when it comes to intelligence. Just a small sample here. So although many of us were shocked by enhanced interrogation techniques, which became longhand for torture in some cases during the global war on terror, a majority of Americans will still support torture to get information to prevent a terrorist attack. Another poll shows that, well, the American people will allow intelligence agencies to spy on people overseas. Yeah, go ahead, CIA, FBI, spy on people overseas. They don't want to be spied on here. And that goes against any profession, because I hear this all the time when I ask people where they say, well, I have nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide. And so even though I'd argue, and this is a big point of the book that Steve picked up on, is liberty and security is a zero-sum game. A little more of one is a little less than the other. But polling is interesting because Americans don't think of it that way. They think that they don't need to trade privacy and freedoms at home to be secure. However, again, it's just like back and forth. Many Americans have still, in spite of saying that, changed how they use technology immediately following reports of domestic surveillance. And so I always remind people you can't have it all. Liberty and security, it implies trade-offs. And finally, and this is the most worrying for civil intelligence relations, well, trust in the federal government has been plummeting, and especially in elected officials and offices. A majority of Americans still trust the CIA and FBI, those are usually the two that are polled, even though they admit that they expect them to violate their privacy. And so, what I like to emphasize is this matters, and Americans, we do have agency in influencing our national security systems. And we're actually one of the actors in this competition over intelligence. So, real quick, there's still more. Bear with me. This ship that I promised to tell you about. I found it in the National Archives in 2018, and I'm from Tampa, Florida, moved back to Tampa. After that trip, I was taking a trip down to Tampa. And so I stopped at Sanford, Florida, named after Henry Shelton Sanford, to the Sanford Historical Society, because I was trying to find the original letter of this ship. So several years and a book contract later, I stumble back into the National Archives, and I have my poll slips, and I show the archivist a couple of the slips, and I say, I'm trying to find pictures for the book, publication quality. And I said, what do I do about microfilm? And she looked at one of the slips and she was like, that's my signature. So she had helped me years ago as like a lost PhD student when I wandered in there. And so she said, leave me your email and I'll see what I can do. So a few days later, she sends me a publication quality scan of the original ship of the Bahamas. And this is my favorite story. And so I want to share the picture with you. So that's the ship. And, when I saw it, it's going to appear in black and white in the book. So here's where you get to see it in color. It's remarkable. I think it's beautiful. It was drawn by a Union spy. And I think it could have been sketched by an artist. And what makes it even better is it's a piece of American intelligence history. And it actually reflects a bigger story about the struggle to build the American intelligence system to coordinate intelligence. And so this ship is part of my personal story. And so when the book gets published, I always told myself, and now it's actually close, so I have to follow through, that I'm going to get it printed and framed. And when I look at it, I'm going to think about my journey. And so just, for the students in the room, I just wanted to, give you, for what it's worth, some advice as you embark on your own journey. So first is to be bold and take chances. I almost didn't submit my paper for the Inman Award because I doubted my ideas and I just didn't think that they had traction. Now I have submitted for other awards and publications and you get rejected. So stay confident and just keep working hard. Savor the victories, like getting a color picture of this awesome painting, and soldier on through the struggles. And the last piece of advice is when you do go to the archives, keep your poll slips. So with that, thank you all very, very much for your time, and I look forward to Q&A.
What are you going to give us the one version?
You'll get 2,000 versions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And I just want to reiterate Professor Slick's words in the beginning about how important this work is. As somebody who studies intelligence and the history of intelligence, and so often it's kind of neglected within history departments as not being that important. I think this book is so fundamental to, I often think of history as putting a brick in the wall. You're not going to be able to make the wall yourself, but you're going to put that first brick and then someone's going to build off of you and onward. And I think this sort of long view of intelligence you take is so fundamentally important. And talk about being bold. I think now being an advisor and having students come to me with project ideas, and if somebody came to me and said, I want to write a history of American intelligence, I'd be like, let's think about how we can scope this project so that it's maybe feasible. So I'm just glad that you did this, and it's inspiration to be bold in my own work. So my first question, I'm gonna make sure we have plenty of time for audience Q&A because I'm sure you guys have a lot to ask. But the first question I wanna ask, and you touched on this at the ending, which I'm so glad, there's this fundamental tension that exists in the book, and I was fortunate, I've read the entire thing. So thank you for that, speed reading. There's this fundamental tension that exists between liberty and security, and as you said, this push and pull of the civilian population in times of war being all too willing to let intelligence sort of take the lead, but then also in times of peace being like, hey, you need to back up, we're Americans, this is not how we do business. In light of our current political times and sort of this idea and notion of the deep state, which so often focuses actually on the intelligence community, how should we be thinking of this relationship moving forward? Is there a way that the American population should be thinking about our relationship with intelligence, and vice versa? Is there a way that the intelligence community should be communicating to the American people about their role and job, obviously keeping sources and methods?
Sure. No, that's the topic right now. It's the hot one. It's a lightning rod. The interesting thing is civil intelligence relations, there's norms of it, and at the same time, you have to be ready for abnormal or aberrations in the norms. And one of the norms of civil military relations, I would argue civil intelligence relations, is we have to remember who's elected and who's unelected, and especially when it comes to security institutions. Now, there's a distinction there, though, that I think military officers, I served barely, I was an infantryman, Massachusetts Army National Guard, but we talk about, we swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and we take that to heart, and it's important. The tension, though, is who we place our trust in. That's elemental here, is who do we trust? Do we trust our own democracy and civil institutions, our own electorate, our own fellow citizens? And how do we trust them in reference to unelected national security services and institutions? I think I can say, looking at how the founders framed it, they were concerned about, at the time especially, national security institutions. They were concerned about a standing army. They wouldn't even talk about espionage at the time. But the interesting thing is, when I look for parallels between real bitter political divisiveness and a little bit of deep state, you read this in chapter 3, during the first decade of our constitutional system, the XYZ affair and the Quasi-War, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists were at each other's throats. And it got nasty, like kind of today nasty. There were the Alien and Sedition Acts. If you've heard, they were promulgated by the Federalists, and they used them to put members of the press in jail, to put members of Congress in jail from the opposite political party, the Democratic Republicans. So, they actually jailed their political opponents using legislation. Another thing that was interesting at the time is there were a lot of conspiracy theories, and there were accusations of collusion. The Democratic Republicans accused the Federalists of being British monarchists and colluding with the British monarchy, and the Federalists accused the Democratic Republicans of being revolutionary, supporters of the French Revolution, which was ongoing at the time. George Washington and John Adams had tried to strike the middle ground, and they got brutalized. There's a famous line that was actually struck by Thomas Jefferson from George Washington's farewell address, where he said something to the extent of, I can't suffer anymore to be buffeted in the press by infamous scribblers. He's talking about journalists. Because even Thomas Paine, who, we all talk about common sense and what a great pamphleteer he was, he turns on Washington by the end, and he accuses him of treachery and being a Julius Caesar and an Oliver Cromwell. And this is Washington, by the way, George Washington. So, I'm always careful What I had, I shared this with the Texas Intelligence Academy at breakfast this morning. It's a weird thing writing about this at this point in time, because I just keep looking back at the history and seeing these periods of just like intense polarization politically, and the way that intelligence can feed it. And one of my concerns is it generally hasn't served the country or the intelligence community well to get involved in politics. It just hasn't served us well. In civil military relations, that's sort of canonical with Huntington, is the military remains apolitical. There hasn't really been an analogy to intelligence. That's why I was watching this happen, as a PhD student, saying, well, do we talk about civil intelligence relations? No, not really. Should we? Probably. And so this is one of the great challenges for our time. We need, how else can I say it as a historian? I'm not going to please everyone. I told Kim, one of the ways I think sometimes I'm doing something right is if I don't please either side. And so I can see intelligence officers saying at different points in time, maybe I criticize the IC too much in my book. And I can see academics telling me at times that it looks like maybe I defend the IC too much. And so what else can I say? The intelligence community has defended American national security for 250 years, while committing controversial activities, abuses, scandals. And I guess my bigger takeaway is, careful what you ask for, because a lot of times the American people were behind them when they did. And so I think that there's one of the ways that I tackle this also with respect to the idea of intelligence failure is I just want there to be more joint accountability. We have a role in this too. So careful what we do and what we ask our intelligence community to do versus our elected officials.
That's great. As your book reveals, much of the early history of America's intelligence, there really isn't this professional intelligence service. There aren't really professional intelligence officers. So often there are diplomats who, on an ad hoc basis go and do a specific mission or get information because of their access, and then they return to their normal jobs as diplomats. And this changes with time, and we do a great job of showing the professionalization, the creation of all of the intelligence agencies in the United States. My question, though, is that, professionalization can kind of read as a good thing, but I would argue that there's real drawbacks to it. And what I was struck with in the early chapters of your book is just the agility and flexibility that exists by having individuals with certain accesses be able to carry out missions versus somebody who goes through a ton of training and is kind of now an intelligence officer. And I work on the Soviet intelligence services, and you want to talk about a bureaucratized system. This is one of the most, vertically hierarchical organizations. And it prevents them a lot of times from changing practices because they're so focused on standardization and process and measuring their metrics with certain standards and not saying, maybe this isn't the way we should be doing this. So my question for you is, do the benefits of professionalizing intelligence outweigh the costs? And is there a way to still maintain some of that flexibility and agility in intelligence, looking at the long history that we've had? Like, can we take the good moments and apply to today's service and not have it be so bureaucratized, I guess?
Yes. So achieving perfection. It's never going to happen. Can we have the best of all worlds? No, not really. I mean, can things be better? Yes. Can things be a lot better? Probably not. How much more do you want to aim for the sky? So this is a great march of history that I just find, because it does come full circle, like you said. Originally, we have diplomat spies. That's kind of the idea, is they maneuvered between the two worlds. Here's the interesting thing, though. Congress doesn't like this because Congress, under the Constitution, has a say in appointing ambassadors and plenipotentiaries of the United States, the advice and consent of the Senate. So the president just uses the Secret Service fund, and it is basically taking these people and saying, you can recognize a country for me. So they're conducting not only intelligence, but also quasi-diplomatic functions without the advice and consent of the Senate. That's one of the pieces of the debate. One of the interesting pieces that you reminded me of was a certain congressman during one of the affairs said, we need people who can blend into the culture, who know the language. And that was also something that the Committee of Secret Correspondence, was an early intelligence sort of committee during the Revolutionary War, wrote to one of the American diplomats overseas, is you need to pretend not to be an American diplomat. You're a merchant and you can speak Parisian French. So this is what I would call proto-professionalism. There's a recognition that intelligence requires certain qualities. As that advances, though, I think it is a good thing to have true intelligence professionals, because what they realized over time was you're torn. If you're a diplomat spy, you're torn between those two functions. Congress has heartburn because they're constitutionally torn, but the individuals themselves, when they write these letters, sometimes they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. It's like, what do you want me to do exactly? Do you want me to do intelligence type stuff, or do you want me to do diplomatic things? And so this is why I do believe in professionalization, and why having the FBI do both law enforcement and domestic intelligence may not be the best idea. But to accelerate the history, so one of the interesting pieces that I found in both the Second World War and also with the later CIA is, by the end of the Second World War, an OSS officer says the OSS is too well known. So what we really need is a secret OSS, Station X, and we're going to put it in New York, and you'll have the OSS still, and that's what the Soviets will be aware of. We have the CIA, the OSS, but we have an even more secret group of truly flexible and dynamic, so it's smaller, because that's part of the issue is bureaucracy grows, but intelligence is like, we need to be small and dynamic. So then one of these OSS officers who goes to the CIA, Harry Rositsky, writes a book in the 60s, 70s, and he says in the 60s and 70s, we have a problem. The CIA is too big and bureaucratic. What we really need is a secret CIA that's going to, so you can see like the arc of this. The idea is the CIA is too bureaucratic now. That's the arc. I mean, that's the problem though, why you can't have it all. I defend professionalism. I think there's a truly distinct intelligence profession that is different from other institutions of national security. But the way that the American state, I don't think I'm telling anyone here that you don't see when you go to the DMV, is we function through administration and bureaucracy. And so we bureaucratize our institutions, including, for instance, intelligence in the form of the CIA. So, it's a balancing act. And I guess, I know this is probably something that the intelligence officers in the room will relate to, but, an organization is no better, no worse, no greater, no less than the sum of the people who are in it. And so it's about the mindset that you cultivate. It's about what you encourage, how you indoctrinate, not a bad word, indoctrinate, how you set parameters for promotion. What do you incentivize? And, if an organization incentivizes bureaucracy and bureaucratization, then that's what they incentivize. I do think that there's ways to incentivize, and create cultures that are more dynamic in national security. Some organizations do it better than others. But, again, I think I fall back on, can things be better? I mean, think about it in your own life. Sure. Can they be a ton better? Like, we're all going to be astronaut SEALs like Johnny Kim, the ER guy. Not that much better. So, yeah.
Great. I want to bring us into the future with this question. So in your epilogue, you touched on the fact that we are in the midst of an intelligence revolution. You have several revolutions that we're going through in this book, and we're in the midst of one now. And you specifically cite some changing new technologies, specifically ubiquitous technical surveillance, smart cities, that could potentially fundamentally challenge the way that intelligence officers do their job.
Yes.
Now, I was an intelligence officer and still get in many heated conversations with colleagues about what this means. And I think you have such a long array of American history. You've seen changes in technology and its impact. I tend to take that view as well and say intelligence will adapt. Yes, the UTS exists, smart cities, the data's out there. It makes it very hard to be undercover, to have any sort of deniability or whatever else, but it'll adapt because it's always adapted. I'm curious for you to weigh into this debate, because you don't really have a final thought in the epilogue. You kind of throw it out there as like, discuss amongst yourself of, is this the end of intelligence as we know it?
So hinting to the crowd, because that's book 2. That's the plan.
We planned that, right? So
we planned that, right?
Yeah.
Well, no, because I guess what I did is I walked through American intelligence history, past to essentially the present, and now I'm thinking about the future. And so just for the benefit of the audience, the idea of the intelligence revolution, I also will shamelessly say, is somewhat derivative. At The Ohio State University, I had to say "the" that time, Steve, instead of "and," because I'm probably beholden to it. But one of the things we're taught is about the military revolution. So you might have heard of revolutions in military affairs, RMAs. And the way that I like to sort of explain this is an RMA changing technology, tactics, doctrine in the military that changes how we fight and conduct wars. So I kind of see it as an inside the military thing. Now, there's elements of government, civil society, private sector that are involved, but it's like, how is the military going to change to adapt to fight these wars? Same thing with something that's been proposed, which is revolutions in intelligence affairs. So changing in tradecraft, technology, doctrine, organizations. How are they going to adapt to changes like this, ubiquitous technical surveillance? What I'm getting at with the intelligence revolution is a little bit bigger, more ambitious, and it's relating to the military revolution. The military revolution, as military historians discuss it, is a period that saw the rise of early modern European states, the centralization of authority, the adaptation of those states to really conduct warfare. And what Jeffrey Parker at Ohio State says, this is the rise of the West. Like, how did the West come to dominate the world? Through the military revolution. And the military revolution is bigger than an RMA because it's not just changes to technology training, doctrine that change warfare. It's things that actually transform states and societies. Like, you have to adapt to conduct warfare. Otherwise, you're going to be like the small Italian city-states that just get squashed out of existence by the 19th century. So for the intelligence revolution, I'm sort of aiming in the same vein, where we've experienced revolutions in intelligence affairs. A great example is the First World War. Radio and airplane. We have overhead reconnaissance. Now we're doing signals intercepts. These are big changes, and the IC adapts to them. I have every confidence that the IC is going to adapt to the changes today. We will figure out how to put people where we want them to be. We will figure out how to probably interrupt, communications technology. Quantum is a big unknown. People are saying, it's unbreakable, but an historian here, measure, countermeasure is the art of history. The thing about the intelligence revolution that worries me more is not about the IC adapting, it's about our country adapting. One of the difficulties that we had during the early global war on terror was we created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, FISA. By 9/11, the NSA had capabilities that policymakers didn't understand. And these are the people who would make the laws that would adjust. And so our statutory law and regime around surveillance wasn't able to accommodate what technology could do. So I'm worried about ubiquitous technical surveillance, smart cities, surveillance technology, where the accelerated pace of change and the need to keep up from a security standpoint outpaces our ability to accommodate it as a matter of constitutional law and civil liberties and the American way of life. That's what worries me more than anything, is that intelligence, I would argue, is going to be more important in the future than it has in the past, to warfare, to competition, to statecraft. And our system, as it exists, can't accommodate that. And our way of life, our very way of life, our belief in privacy, civil liberties as they're expressed through the Constitution, restrictions on surveillance, we only began to engage it. Some of you might have missed the debate over Section 702 of FISA, but this caused a lot of heartburn in Congress. National security officials will tell you it is essential for security. And I wouldn't dispute that. A lot of great security things are essential for security. I know it's a tautology. Are they essential for liberty, though? Or do they erode that? This is my big concern with where we're going with an intelligence revolution, is it transforms state and society. So how are we going to transform in response to this?
That's fantastic. I have another question, but I get to have dinner with him tonight. So I will ask my questions on my own time, but I want to open it up now. If you're happy, I can do the polling.
Yeah, of course.
So let's go to the gentleman back in the burnt orange.
Well, thank you. You sort of said we got to where we are in the intelligence community through a very serendipitous and unplanned series of events. And you also said that shaking it up and restructuring things is a good thing. So be careful what you wish for. We've got that with this administration.
Mm-hmm.
How would you rate specific things that the Trump administration is doing? Do you think there's an overall plan?
Well, to the response to the serendipity, there were, so one of the things I should have sort of prefaced that a little bit by saying, it wasn't all completely unplanned. One of the things that I like, and I thought this was just fascinating, is I don't think that there has ever been, except for the creation of this country, as much serious, coherent thought put into the future as there was during the Second World War. And not just in intelligence. I mean, the amount of work that I saw put into what the post-war system would look like, now it included rivalries and pettiness and, real contested and sometimes even offensive remarks in some of these memoranda. But that also applied to national security writ large. It applied to the global economy. I mean, we had seriously good thinkers thinking very hard about what the future of the world would be. So I don't know if we've ever replicated that since, though. That amount of serious thought. I would say, based on my study of intelligence in the 90s, we didn't. We didn't really think as hard. There were debates about intelligence in the 90s, but not as much coherent, serious thought about, like, what do we want the post-Cold War world to look like. As far as the politicization piece there, so that's something that we have to accommodate. I mean, we can't change that. So one of the things that is now in the news, as of recently we spoke about this morning, is NSA. Should the NSA be separate from Cybercom? I will lean on people senior to me because for an organization which the Society for Intelligence History, Steve mentioned, I'm the vice president of it, we had a conference in DC in February, and we had 3 former DNIs and a former DCIA there. So Clapper, Hayden, Negroponte, and McCollum. And Ellen Nakashima of the Washington Post asked, should NSA and Cybercom be split? You can see this online, so I'm not saying anything. It wasn't Chatham House. Hayden said yes, he thought it should. McConnell said yes, but not yet. And Clapper was kind of the middle ground. As far as having civilian leadership, that was also something that they remarked on. My view, so this kind of goes to the pieces. Right now, sort of like the focus is the president and this administration is going to split NSA and Cybercom, put a political loyalist at the head of NSA. If it happens, I can't change that. You know what I mean? But what I can say is, how can we change the parameters of the debate? So would it be a good idea to split NSA and Cybercom? I do see virtue in doing that. I think a lot of the ways the NSA was created were due to factors at the time that still don't stand today. The technology's changed dramatically. The power of the NSA as an organization and its mandate, I think, eclipses the Department of Defense. I would like to see it be a civilian agency with a civilian head and not. The NSA hid for a long time, very effectively, from oversight in DoD. I don't think it hides as well today, but I can see virtues, and the biggest virtue that I see is a balance of power. The military not only is the strongest institution of national security in the sense of having arms and ammunition, but this goes back to Civil Military Relations 101. If our founders were worried about a standing army and the threat that the military poses to liberty, why would we give it so much intelligence power as well, aside from the raw military power that we give it? And that's part of my point, is if I'm correct, that intelligence is going to be more important to statecraft and conflict in the future, then perhaps having a system that still prioritizes the military may not be the best approach. It might be better to have a sort of a more balance of power. So I hope that sort of addresses the question, because again, I'm talking about a reform effort with intelligence that pre-exists this political moment with splitting the NSA and Cybercom.
See any students? No students. Wow. Okay.
No students.
No. Are you in the
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the messaging that you talked about for ratting out your neighbors.
Oh yeah.
We go through waves of that. There were Slavs in the 1920s who might be Reds, your German named neighbor, and you might be a Nazi spy, Arabs after 9/11, and today the messaging of war on gangs and your undocumented Hispanic neighbor might be a member. How do you see those waves affecting the public's understanding of what intelligence should do, what they expect from it?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, because I cannot emphasize in words, at each period of American history where there's a crisis, there are letters of people who just can't wait to tell you the way that someone they know is a spy. And, there's a great quote that I'm trying to remember as closely as possible in a history of the United States, where they talk about the First World War. And basically what they say is, the Tory during the American Revolution, the pro-British loyalist, became the Federalist during the War of 1812, became the Copperhead, that's the Democrats in favor of the Confederacy during the Civil War, became the German in the First World War. And Robert Lansing, whom I mentioned, he wrote what he called the extraordinary mania that afflicted the country. And he said something like, a person shaving was interpreted as a signal to a German sub. This is where little things like that. So this does affect, I think, intelligence in the sense of we over ask. we over ask of the IC, and we don't put a lot of restrictions on what it does. And then after the emergency, in our perception, it might not even be a matter of reality, it might be perception. After the emergency sort of starts to slide away, then we start the investigations of the intelligence community and say, how could you do that? Because literally everyone asked you to after 9/11. We all did. Members of Congress who later sort of came out against enhanced interrogation were all for extraordinary rendition of terrorist suspects. That worries me because, again, I don't think we're capable, to be perfectly honest. One of my PhD, the core committee members, I should have said parenthetically, also don't write long dissertations for the sake of your committee. And you can ask Colonel Pete Mansour at Ohio State when he saw it. The original dissertation was like 1,200 double-spaced pages. He's like, I'm not reading this. And then he did. But one of my dissertation members, Paula Baker, who's an American political historian, said, Jeff, it sounds like you want us to change the American people. And during the Second World War, Field Marshal Alan Brooke wrote a letter to General Sir Harold Alexander, and he said, the American people are mercurial. They're either up or down. I'm not sure I can change your temperament. I don't think we'll be as stoic as the Brits. But if you think about it in terms of the best way I can, say it is let's say a wave, like a sine wave. These ups and downs that we go through, what I would hope to see through public awareness of this tendency, this is our tendency, is to tighten it up. So that way we don't have as vast changes, because that's what really produces it, is the vast swings between liberty and security. Use a shooting metaphor. Can we tighten our shot group so we're not all over the place? And I don't have an answer for it, because what I also come back to is, put yourself in the shoes of the emergencies after 9/11, for instance, for those of you who have memory in the room, and, for the national security practitioners in the room, what would you do to keep your family safe? What would you do to, stop people from attacking the country? When you're an intelligence officer, you feel that collective pressure. And John Yoo, who wrote what were called the torture memos for the Office of Legal Counsel, and he's been hammered subsequently because he basically gave legal defense to a lot of what we now consider objectionable, and as I said by public polling, not everybody, activities. He said, you don't realize what we felt like at the time. We thought the next attack was right around the corner. And that's what we had to do. And just to close that out, because again, I'd like to show this long march of history. In an earlier point in time, another congressman had said the same thing, which is essentially, this is during the church, I'm sorry, not a congressman, it was, I believe it might have been Bill Sullivan of the FBI, but during the church committee hearings, he said, I was in a lot of government meetings as a member of the FBI with principals, elected officials, and I never heard them talk about ethics. They only talked about keeping the country safe from communism. So again, what do I go back to? And it may seem like an unsatisfactory answer, but this is a cultural problem. This is an us problem. So to whatever benefit it is, part of the point of the book is public awareness. This is us. So if we want to change it, this is a collective conversation. I can't change it individually. I can't legislate this. I can't create doctrine or operations for the CIA to fix this problem.
In the back.
Hi, I'm a second year economics major, and I was just curious about how oftentimes when the intelligence community comes under fire, it's because, as a movie, they do something bad. 9/11 or whistleblowers. And when they're at their best, no one is talking about them, right? When they're doing their job well. So I was just wondering is there any way to reconcile how the CIA, how the intelligence community can gain more public trust without being able to articulate, here's all the harm that we are preventing? Is that a really goal?
That's an excellent question. So this goes back to a very famous line that JFK said when Allen Dulles, the longest serving director of Central Intelligence, is forced to resign. But, he says, at the CIA, he says, your successes are unheralded, your failures are trumpeted. And Arthur Schlesinger had wrote that to him in a memorandum that's been declassified, by the way, with the JFK files. So I often will tell my friends in the IC, there's a famous poem by Rudyard Kipling called Tommy. If you've heard it before, Tommy this and Tommy that, and thrown out the group, but savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. So one thing you have to do, a friend of mine once told me in a different setting, was you have to know the game you're in. So for intelligence officers and aspiring intelligence officers, the first thing I'd say is know the game you're in, or know the game you're getting into. You have to have a certain amount of resilience to complaints. You're going to get it from everybody. But again, from the public awareness side, I think that one of the things that I tackle other than successes, because one of the issues with successes is this is the argument against revealing them, it might jeopardize sources and methods because you have to sort of say, we stopped something. It's like, wait, what did you stop? How did you stop it? And next thing you know, you're tugging apart pieces and we're putting people's lives at risk. So instead, one of the ways I tackle it was with intelligence failure, because aside from controversies that deal with like scandals and like enhanced interrogation, for instance, another way that the IC and the CIA often come under fire is they failed. And what I usually point out, and this is a truism, is that there's no policy failures, only intelligence failures. A lot of times policy failure precedes intelligence failure and becomes policy failure again. And so I look at some of the failures that the CIA has been accused of, particularly early in the Cold War, and sort of show that the CIA, I mean, it wasn't truly a failure. It wasn't that they completely missed it. It's that you're not in the business of prediction. And so this is, I think, more of a public understanding issue about what the limits and uses of intelligence are and what intelligence is for and what it can really do for you at the best of times. So again, I see this, again, less as an inside the IC issue and more as an us and our perspective issue. I do want to address one issue that you mentioned, though, with trust. Trust is essential. Trust in democracy is essential. Trust in unelected, secret organizations. That's at the heart of civil intelligence relations. That's the heartburn. I say this in the introduction, so Steve's read it. I had this conversation with some friends of mine. Alexandra, you've read it too.
Yeah, I have.
So this is something that I say slightly different. Sometimes whenever there's a scandal, you'll see someone from the CIA or a government official come out and say, don't worry, everyone, there's nothing un-American about intelligence. The way I start the book is, that's wrong. Intelligence is un-American. That is the problem. That is the root of the problem. The people who do it aren't. They're Americans, just like us. You know, they want to support and defend the Constitution. But everything about the profession of intelligence, the profession, is un-American in spirit. Keeping secrets, not even telling your fellow citizens, your own wife, your husband, your kids, what you do, like everything about that goes against the grain. So that's an irreconcilable tension. There is always going to be a degree of public skepticism, and that skepticism can be good when we use it for reasonable, rational oversight, but it can be bad when it falls into conspiracy theory. And so, you know, this is why you read history. So you can see where the IC really failed and where it only kind of failed and we failed too. And I think that helps build a little bit of trust. But what I will say is we're never going to achieve perfect trust because the profession of intelligence goes against everything we believe in as Americans. So that's just something that you have to know as a member of the IC and as an American.
I think we'll end on that note. I know we have a lot of questions, so maybe
I'm
you'll
still
stick
here.
around
Yes,
for a
I'm gonna
second,
stick
but
around.
thank you so much. And my understanding comes out in May, right?
Yeah,
But
June said it. June said
Oxford
it.
University Press, I encourage you to get a copy.